The air in Geneva was thick with tension, like the calm before a storm. The city, once a beacon of hope for the Protestant Reformation, was now a powder keg ready to explode. It was the year 1538, and the leaders of the Reformation, Calvin and William Farel, had just been expelled from the city. The reasons were complex, but the consequences were immediate and brutal. Imagine a city where the church and the state were intertwined, where every decision was scrutinized and every word was weighed. In such a place, a small disagreement could turn into a full-blown crisis. That's exactly what happened in Geneva. Calvin and Farel had been the spiritual leaders of the city, guiding its transformation from a Catholic stronghold to a Protestant haven. But their strict and sometimes harsh methods had made them many enemies. The city council, feeling threatened by their influence, decided to kick them out. It was a decision that would change the course of history. The streets of Geneva were filled with whispers of rebellion and fear. Some citizens supported the council's decision, while others felt betrayed. The church, once a source of comfort and guidance, was now a source of division and conflict. The air was thick with the smell of burning leaves and the sound of angry voices. One of the key figures in this drama was Antoine Marcourt, a pastor who had been aligned with Calvin and Farel. He was known for his fiery sermons and his strong opposition to anyone who threatened the Reformation. Marcourt, along with other supporters of Calvin, found themselves in a difficult position. They were torn between their loyalty to their leaders and their duty to the city. The tension reached its peak when the council decided to replace Calvin and Farel with new pastors, men who were more willing to follow the council's orders. These new leaders, including Master Antoine Marcourt, were given the task of distributing the Eucharist, a sacred ritual that had become a symbol of the city's religious identity. But many of the citizens, including Marcourt, refused to accept these new leaders. They saw them as impostors, men who had no right to take the place of Calvin and Farel. The council, frustrated by this resistance, took action. They summoned the citizens who had refused to receive the Eucharist and demanded explanations. The situation was tense, and the air was filled with anger and resentment. Marcourt and his supporters were given a choice: accept the new leaders or leave the city. For many, it was a choice between their faith and their home. One of the most powerful moments in this conflict came when Marcourt and the other pastors from Geneva met with their counterparts in the nearby city of Bern. They were desperate for support and understanding. In a letter, they explained their situation, describing the insults and accusations they had faced. They were called infidels, papists, and corrupters of the Scriptures. It was a heavy burden to bear, and they felt isolated and alone. But the pastors of Bern, recognizing the gravity of the situation, offered a hand of friendship. They welcomed the Geneva pastors as brothers and acknowledged their role as faithful ministers of Christ. This act of solidarity was a ray of light in the darkness, but it did little to ease the tension back in Geneva. As the days passed, the conflict only deepened. More and more citizens were summoned to the council, and more were forced to choose sides. The city was divided, and the future was uncertain. Would Geneva return to its old ways, or would it find a new path forward? The storm was brewing, and no one knew what would come next. But one thing was clear: the city of Geneva was at a crossroads, and the choices made in those tense days would shape its destiny for years to come. The 1550s were a tough time for the Calvinists. While John Calvin was seen as a hero in Geneva, things were not going well outside the city. Calvin faced many challenges from other pastors, political leaders, and even other reformers. This was a time when anti-Calvinist sentiment was growing, and it led to some significant defeats for Calvin and his followers. One of the key figures in this struggle was André Zébédée. He started as a friend of Calvin, but became one of his strongest opponents. Zébédée's journey from ally to enemy is a fascinating part of this story. Zébédée was a brilliant young teacher in Bordeaux, France. He was well respected and had a promising career ahead of him. However, he decided to move to Switzerland, where he became a pastor in a small town called Orb. This was a big step down for him, but he saw it as an opportunity to spread his religious ideas. At first, Zébédée worked well with other reformers like Pierre Viret. They shared similar goals and worked together to spread the new Protestant ideas. But things started to change in the late 1540s when a major dispute broke out in Lausanne over the Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper. Zébédée and Viret had different ideas about what the Eucharist meant, and this disagreement led to a heated conflict. Viret, who was a close ally of Calvin, was nearly forced out of the Lausanne Academy because of this dispute. Zébédée, on the other hand, became more influential and began to challenge Calvin's teachings. He especially disagreed with Calvin's idea of double predestination, which is the belief that God has already decided who will be saved and who will be damned. Zébédée's opposition to Calvin gained him support from other important figures, like Jerome, Bolsec, and Jacques de Bourgogne, Seigneur de Falais. Bolsec was another critic of Calvin, and he had strong backing from Falais, who owned a large estate in the region. Together, they formed a powerful anti-Calvinist coalition. This coalition achieved some significant victories in 1555. The political leaders in Bern, a powerful city in Switzerland, banned Calvin's catechism and prohibited the use of his institutes at the Lausanne Academy. They also forbade their citizens from taking communion in Geneva and ordered their officials to burn any books by Calvin or other reformers that were considered harmful. This was a major blow to Calvin and his followers. The success of the anti-Calvinists showed that Calvin's dominance in Francophone Protestantism was not a sure thing. In 1555, Calvin only had control over Geneva, and his influence in the rest of the region was weakening. Other areas like Bern, the Vaud, and Montbéliard strongly resisted Calvin's leadership. Even in the late 1550s, it was unclear whether Calvinism would become the dominant form of Protestantism in the region. The story of André Zébédée and the anti-Calvinist movement in the 1550s is a reminder that history is often more complex than it seems. Calvin's eventual success was not guaranteed, and his opponents played a significant role in shaping the early years of the Reformation in Switzerland. Zébédée's life took many turns, and his journey through the religious and intellectual landscape of the 16th century is a fascinating one. When he first arrived in Switzerland, he was close to Calvin, Farel, and Viret, but he gradually became concerned about the Calvinists' shift away from Zwinglian theology, especially on the nature of the ministry and the sacraments. This shift made him start to befriend the Calvinists' enemies in the Pays de Vaud. However, his break from Calvin didn't happen overnight. It took nearly a decade, showing that personal relationships were as important as theology in shaping the networks of the time. By 1547, when Zébédée became the arts professor at the Lausanne Academy, his relationship with the Calvinists was already strained. A bitter quarrel with Viret and other Lausanne ministers and professors soon followed, leading to Zébédée's fall from grace among the Calvinists. Over the next decade, he became a leading voice of dissent against Calvinist dominance. Zébédée's early life is a bit of a mystery. We know he came from Brabant in the Low Countries, but not exactly where or when he was born. He probably wasn't a native French speaker, but spent his entire career in French-speaking lands. He might have studied at the universities of Louvain and Paris, but this is just a guess based on his background and first teaching job. In 1533 or 1534, he appeared in the public record as a teacher at the Collège de Yennes in Bordeaux. Since he likely finished his university education just before this, and we know he died between 1570 and 1572, it's safe to say he was born around 1510, making him about the same age as Calvin and Farel. In Bordeaux, Zébédée was surrounded by learned men at a humanist school, under the direction of André de Gouveia, a Portuguese humanist. The school was a hub of evangelical ideas, and several teachers there had similar beliefs. Zébédée had connections to important political figures in Bordeaux, many of whom were also evangelical. During his time in France, he was part of Marguerite of Navarre's evangelical network, even if only peripherally. His salary at the Collège de Guyenne was one of the highest, allowing him to live in a lovely house by the Garonne River. Despite making more than his colleagues, he wasn't resented. Instead, they encouraged him to return to the school after a trip to Spain. However, Zébédée had his enemies in Bordeaux, though their identities and the reasons for the conflicts are unclear. The Guyenne Parliament began cracking down on evangelical ideas in 1534 and 1535, which might explain why Zébédée left for Spain. He did return to Bordeaux and was still there at the end of 1536, but then he disappeared from the records until 1538, when he was found in Geneva. In Geneva, Zébédée aligned himself with Calvin and Farel, not their replacements, Marcourt and Morand. Farel praised Zébédée's teaching in Orbe, a small town in the Vaud, saying he earned respect from even the impious and papists. Zébédée stood with Farel and Viret during a meeting with Pierre Quiroli, and later traveled with Viret to Bern to report on the conference and plead for the persecuted Waldensians. He was one of the first to urge Calvin to return to Geneva, and later traveled with Viret to Neuchâtel to advise Reformed pastors facing Lutheran reforms. However, Zébédée showed signs of frustration early on. His move to Orbe was a significant step down from his academic post in Bordeaux, where he had interacted with notable intellectuals. In Orbe, he missed the company of other scholars and had to set aside his humanist studies to focus on the demanding duties of a pastor with a much lower salary. He also had theological tensions with his friends, particularly his strong support for Zwingli. In 1539, he circulated 2 poems praising Zwingli, one a translation and the other an original piece. This unapologetic Zwinglianism affected his relationship with Calvin, who defended Bucer against Zébédée's criticisms. Zébédée's position as pastor in Orbe placed him in the chapter of Yerdon, where he got along well enough with his colleagues to be elected dean in 1542. However, this led to another conflict. When the deans were summoned to Bern to hear new decrees, Zébédée accepted them without question, much to Calvin's dismay. He also ran into trouble in Orbe, where he clashed with the town's Catholic vicar, leading to his arrest and forced apology to the Fribourg authorities. The banishment was overturned, but the Bernese thought it prudent for Zébédée and Malengry to switch posts temporarily. Despite these issues, Zébédée was still seen as a Calvinist ally. When a position opened at the Lausanne Academy in 1546, Viret nominated him, hoping his presence and erudition would be an asset. Zébédée began his new role in 1547, serving as Master of the 12, a position of prestige. He received a substantial salary, which was initially twice as much as the next highest paid professor. However, within a year, Zébédée and Farel were at each other's throats over the Eucharist and the power of the ministry, marking the beginning of Zébédée's transformation into a leading voice of dissent against Calvinist hegemony. Zébédée's early career in Switzerland showcases how personal friendships played a crucial role in shaping the evangelical networks of the time. Zébédée, like many other reformers, preferred the teachings of Zwingli over those of Bucer or Calvin. He was part of an anti-Calvinist network that formed in opposition to Calvin, supporting figures like Caroli and Marcourt. Although Zébédée had connections with Marguerite's network in France, he came from a different region, Bordeaux, which meant he wasn't well acquainted with the humanists in the Meuse circle. When Zébédée arrived in Geneva in 1538, he aligned himself with Calvin, likely due to their shared connection to Mathurin Cordier, Calvin's teacher in Paris, and Zébédée's colleague in Bordeaux. This friendship masked their theological differences for a while, but as Zébédée formed new relationships and grew resentful over some grievances, their disagreements became more apparent. By 1548, these differences came to a head when Zébédée took a position at the Lausanne Academy. Soon after joining the Lausanne Academy, Zébédée found himself in a heated theological battle with his friend Pierre Viret and many of his new colleagues. The main issues were the interpretation of the Eucharist and the understanding of pastoral power and authority. Zébédée defended the traditional Zwinglian position, while Viret and most of the Academy's faculty sided with Calvin. This conflict was significant because the Lausanne Academy was the only Protestant institution of higher learning in French-speaking Europe at the time. Zébédée nearly won the struggle, but the Bernese authorities, who had a practical interest in maintaining stability, decided to keep Viret and the Calvinists in place. Zébédée was transferred from Lausanne, but he emerged as a stronger leader among the anti-Calvinists in the Vaud region. The tension began in October 1547, when the Lausanne colloquies, which were regular meetings for theological discussions, started debating the power of the ministry. The theses proposed by Jean Ribet, a theology professor, were controversial and aligned with Calvin's views, which differed significantly from Zwingli's. For example, one thesis claimed that ministers have the power to bind and forgive sins, a concept that Zwinglians rejected. Zébédée was disturbed by these ideas and reported them to the Bernese pastors, setting off a chain of events that would lead to a formal review of the theses. The debates extended to the sacraments, particularly the Eucharist. Viret's early manuscript of his book on the power and use of the ministry and the sacraments further stirred the pot. Viret's view that the Eucharist involves a real bodily presence of Christ, as opposed to a purely symbolic one, was at odds with Zwinglian doctrine. This became a point of intense disagreement between Zébédée and Viret. A pivotal moment came during the examination of a student, Guy Hubrock, in December 1547. Zébédée and Viret clashed over the nature of the Eucharist, with Viret arguing for a spiritual and bodily presence of Christ, and Zébédée insisting that the two were mutually exclusive. The debate continued at the next colloquy, where a thesis attacking Zwinglian views on the sacraments was added to the discussion. Concerned about the undermining of Zwinglian teachings, Zébédée alerted a colleague in Bern, who brought the issue to the city council. The council reviewed the theses and found 10 of them to be contrary to Bern's Reformation theology. Farel and his colleagues defended their positions, but the Zwinglian pastors in Bern, including Jodocus Kilchmeyer, rejected their arguments. 3 Calvinist supporters, Simon Sulzer, Beek Gering, and Konrad Schmid, were expelled from Bern, indicating the council's theological leanings. However, the Bernese decided not to expel Viret and his colleagues from Lausanne. This decision was influenced by practical considerations, such as the significant investment in the Lausanne Academy and the need for Protestant unity in the face of external threats. The Bernese asked Zébédée to leave Lausanne, transferring him to Yverdon. They did not believe he had done anything wrong, but his position had become untenable. Despite being outnumbered in Lausanne, Zébédée had supporters, including Piet Comte, a former pastor who shared his theological views and personal grievances. Louis Corbeil, Lausanne student, also stood by Zébédée, becoming a long-term ally and a critic of Farel and the Calvinists. The outcome of this conflict had far-reaching implications. The Lausanne Academy continued under Calvinist influence, training many second-generation Reformed pastors who would go on to shape French Protestantism. If Zébédée and his allies had won the Academy's teachings, and the future of French Protestantism might have been very different. Jérôme Bolsec, another significant figure in the anti-Calvinist movement, was a former Carmelite monk, known for his harsh criticism of Calvin. Bolsec's biography of Calvin, written to counter Theodore Beza's favorable account, was highly controversial. While he faced significant opposition from Calvinists, Bolsec's work reflects the deep divisions within the Reformed community. During his time in Romandy, Bolsec's anti-Calvinist stance resonated with many who were dissatisfied with Calvin's leadership. Bolsec's influence helped consolidate the anti-Calvinist party in the Suisse romande, further complicating the already tense religious landscape. The tension in the air was thick as Jérôme Bolsec, a former Carmelite monk turned physician, stood before a congregation in Geneva in 1551. Bolsec, known for his sharp mind and bold opinions, had a bone to pick with John Calvin, the city's most influential religious leader. Bolsec's issue was with Calvin's doctrine of double predestination, which stated that God had predestined some for salvation and others for damnation. To Bolsec, this made God a tyrant and an idol, much like the pagan gods of old. Bolsec argued that, while God foreknew who would be damned, the reprobate earned their fate through their own wickedness, not by a divine whim. Calvin, known for his strict and sometimes harsh approach to religious matters, was furious. He demanded that Bolsec be arrested and imprisoned. Calvin even wanted Bolsec to be executed for heresy, but the other churches in the region didn't agree, and the Genevan authorities could only banish Bolsec from the city. Bolsec, who was already living outside Geneva at the estate of Jacques de Bourgogne, Seigneur de Falais, simply returned to his employer's home. Falais, a nobleman from the Low Countries, had fled religious persecution and found refuge in the area. He was a friend of Calvin's, but the Bolsec affair changed that. Falais supported Bolsec, seeing the Genevan authorities' actions as an attempt to silence any who dared question Calvin. Falais believed that Christians should be allowed to debate doctrine without fear of imprisonment. This marked the beginning of a significant break between Falais and Calvin. Falais's estate at Végy, just a short distance from Geneva, became a hub for those who opposed Calvin. The local pastor, Michel Perret, and others like Jean Lange, a pastor from Bersons, joined in the criticism. Even Genevan pastors, such as Philippe d'Ecclesia and François de Saint Paul, expressed their reservations about Calvin's teachings. Jean Collinet, a schoolmaster in Geneva, kept his friend Sébastien Castellio updated on the events at Végy, and Zébédée, a well-known anti-Calvinist, visited the estate frequently. The dispute didn't end with Bolsec's banishment. In 1552, Philippe d'Ecclesia and Jean Trolliet, a former monk and a friend of Calvin's political opponent, Aimé Perrin, continued the fight. The Ecclesia was accused of supporting Bolsec's doctrines and was eventually deposed by the Geneva Council. Trolliet, who had a long-standing grudge against Calvin, was accused of criticizing Calvin's teachings and spreading a text against him. The Geneva Council eventually settled the dispute by affirming Calvin's teachings, but acknowledging Trolliet as a good citizen. François de Saint Paul, a pastor from Vevey, joined the fray, criticizing Calvin's doctrine of predestination and visiting Farel's estate frequently. The Lausanne ministers tried to adopt Calvinist resolutions on predestination, but St. Paul refused to accept them, deeming them too harsh. The Bernese ministers, who were trying to remain neutral, grew frustrated with the Calvinists and warned the Lausanne ministers not to propose new doctrines that would be used to harass those who didn't agree. In 1553, Zébédée, a pastor from Nyon, entered the picture. Nyon was close to Geneva and Viagy, allowing Zébédée to keep up with the events and join forces with Bolsec and Farel. Zébédée, along with Jean Lange and Thomas Malingry, ensured that the Morzins' chapter, which was already anti-Calvinist, remained steadfast in its opposition. Zébédée also maintained ties with Sebastian Castellio, who was deeply disturbed by the execution of Michael Servetus in Geneva. The anti-Calvinists, though they didn't support Servetus's anti-Trinitarian views, shared Castellio's disgust with the execution. By 1554, Zébédée had taken a leading role in the fight against Calvin's doctrine of predestination. He, along with Lange and Bolsec, publicly accused Calvin of not just error, but heresy. The Geneva pastors were outraged and complained to the Bernese, but the Bern Council refused to support them. Instead, the Bern Council warned the Geneva pastors not to offend or defame their subjects. Even Johannes Haller, a Bernese minister who had once been a voice of accommodation, grew weary of Calvin's complaints and began to refer to the Pays de Vaud as our Africa, alluding to the bitter church struggles of the early Christian era. François de St. Paul, undeterred, composed a short treatise on predestination which he wanted to publish in Bern, but he never received permission. The tensions between the Calvinists and the anti-Calvinists only grew, and the struggle over religious doctrine continued to shape the religious landscape of the region for years to come. In January 1555, a group of men, Zébédée, Lange, and Bolsec, traveled to Bern, a powerful city in Switzerland. They carried a list of complaints against John Calvin, a famous religious leader who had been advocating for a specific interpretation of Christianity. Their complaints went beyond the usual arguments about predestination, which is the idea that God has already decided who will be saved. They also brought passages from Calvin's books, saying these were heretical, scandalous, and as bad as the Catholic Mass. The Bern Council, which was like the city's government, listened to their complaints. To the surprise of many, the council sided with Zébédée and his friends. On January 26, 1555, the council sent letters to their pastors and local leaders, telling them to stop any new ideas, disputes about predestination, and the celebration of communion according to Calvin's methods. Zébédée was thrilled, but the Calvinists were furious. The Genevans, who supported Calvin, tried to appeal to Bern, but to no avail. The Bernese agreed to a hearing, but once again, Zébédée and his allies won. On April 3, 1555, the Bern Council officially rejected Calvin's teachings. They declared that any books or people with messages against their own Reformation would not be tolerated. They even said that such books should be burned. The council insisted that only their officially approved catechism, a book of religious instruction, should be used, not Calvin's. They also banned the use of Calvin's famous book, the Institutes, at the Lausanne Academy, a school in their territory. This decision by Bern was a huge blow to Calvin and his followers. Calvin protested strongly, but the damage was done. The news spread, and his enemies were delighted. François Bottien wrote about it in his 1562 treatise, and Charles Dumoulin mentioned it in 1565, even though it had been a decade since the event. Dumoulin received a copy of the decree while he was in Montbéliard. and an unpublished manuscript in the French National Library contains a copy of the letter suggesting that it was widely known and distributed. In 1555, while Calvin and his allies in Geneva were celebrating their victory by extending voting rights to French refugees and driving out their opponents, things were not going well outside Geneva. Bern, which had been a strong ally, now turned against Calvin and ended its political alliance with Geneva. Calvin's teachings were banned from the Lausanne Academy, and his relationship with Zurich worsened. Theologians everywhere were criticizing his doctrine of predestination, calling him a tyrant. Despite his success in Geneva, Calvin must have felt the weight of these setbacks. The situation in the Pays de Vaud, a large, French-speaking Protestant territory, was particularly challenging for Calvin. Despite his efforts, he and his allies failed to win over the people there. In 1558, 4 pastors from the Thonon chapter were expelled from Bern's lands for preaching Calvin's doctrine of predestination. Jean Davian, who shared Bolsec's views, was appointed as a pastor in Grandson, a town in Bern's territory. This was a clear sign that the anti-Calvinists were gaining ground. Pierre Viret, a prominent Calvinist, was struggling with the Bernese over the right to excommunicate people from the church. When he delayed the Christmas Eucharist, the Bernese had enough and banished Viret. Most of his colleagues in Lausanne followed him to Geneva and then to France. The Bernese replaced them with pastors from their German-speaking lands and hired Piet Comte, a supporter of Zébédée, as a professor. Even Sebastian Castellio, one of Calvin's most vocal critics, was considered for a position in Lausanne, though he was ultimately seen as too controversial. By the end of 1558, Calvinism in the Vaud had collapsed. The anti-Calvinists had won, and Calvin's influence in the region was all but gone. The struggle for control of the Francophone Reformed community in the 1550s was intense, and the Calvinists' ultimate victory was far from certain. Sebastian Castellio, a recurring figure in this story, was closely tied to the anti-Calvinist network in the Vaud. His connections and influence extended beyond the local disputes, and he deserves a closer look. Castellio's story is a testament to the complex and often bitter conflicts that shaped the Reformation in Switzerland. In the mid-1500s, a time of great religious upheaval in Europe, a man named Zébédée found himself at the heart of a storm. Zébédée, a former teacher at the Collège de Guyenne in France, had moved to Orbe, a small town in the Pays de Vaud, where he became a Protestant pastor. His salary was modest, about 80 florins a year, which was roughly half of what he had earned in France. This financial strain only added to the challenges he faced in his new role. Zébédée's life became even more complicated when he got involved in a heated debate over the nature of the Eucharist. The bread and wine that Christians believe symbolize the body and blood of Jesus Christ. He wrote poems praising Ulrich Zwingli, a leading Protestant reformer, which were later transcribed by Rudolf Gualther and sent to Heinrich Bullinger. One of these poems read, Hoc ad opus preti ver summi Zwinglius unusi poxerto mititur or de, which means, this great man Zwingli is sent by God to fulfill his purpose. However, Zébédée's admiration for Zwingli did not sit well with everyone. John Calvin, a prominent figure in the Protestant movement, was critical of Zébédée's high praise. Calvin believed that Zébédée's poem suggested that no one could be greater than Zwingli, a sentiment Calvin found problematic. In a letter to his friend William Farel, Calvin wrote, I do not like Zébédée's poem, in which he says it is wrong to hope for anyone greater than Zwingli. Zébédée's conflicts extended beyond his writings. In 1542, he was accused of preaching for an excessively long time. from 7 to 11, which caused a disturbance in the church. This led to a confrontation with the local authorities, and he was, briefly, imprisoned. After his release, he was forced to make a public apology, which included acknowledging the Virgin Mary and the saints, a practice that was at odds with his Protestant beliefs. The tension between Zébédée and the local Catholic authorities escalated further. On Palm Sunday, Zébédée interrupted a Catholic vicar, assistant priest, while he was giving a sermon, causing a commotion. The situation worsened on Good Friday, when Zébédée preached for hours, leading the governor to intervene and force him to stop. Zébédée and his supporters were then banned from the region by the authorities of Fribourg, while the Bernese authorities, who were Protestant, supported him. Zébédée's struggles did not end there. In 1545, he was forced to leave his position in Yverdon, and later found a new role in Aubonne. His reputation for being difficult and contentious followed him, and he continued to be a source of contention among the Protestant leaders. Pierre Viry, a prominent Protestant reformer in Lausanne, wrote to Calvin about Zébédée's negative attitude, expressing concern about his willingness to change his position. Despite these challenges, Zébédée was still considered for a position at the Collège de Lausanne, a prestigious institution. Viret wrote to Calvin, suggesting that Zébédée might be a good fit for the college. However, the relationship between Viry and Zébédée remained strained, and Viret continued to express his reservations about Zébédée's views and behavior. In 1547, the theological debates in Lausanne reached a new level of intensity. The Bernese authorities who supported the Protestant movement condemned several of the theses that Zébédée and others had proposed during a colloquy. These theses included statements about the nature of the ministry and the sacraments, such as the belief that ministers have the power to bind and loose sins, and that the sacraments are more than just external symbols. One of the key figures in these debates was Pierre Viret, who wrote a book titled De la vertu et usage du ministère de la parole de Dieu et des sacrements dépendance de celle, on the virtue and use of the ministry of the Word of God and the sacraments. In this book, Viret argued that the ministry of the gospel is a key to knowledge and the kingdom of heaven, and that ministers have the power to bind and loose sins, as well as to govern the church. The debates in Lausanne were not isolated. Similar discussions were taking place in other Protestant centers, such as Zurich and Geneva. In Zurich, the pastors had written a letter to Jodocus, Kilchmeyer, and others, emphasizing that the ministers and the sacraments do not confer anything, but rather announce the Word of God. In Geneva, the congregations of the Company of Pastors were influential in shaping the theological landscape. Zébédée's involvement in these debates often put him at odds with his colleagues. In 1547, he was examined by the Bernese authorities, who were concerned about his views on the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. The examination took place just before Christmas, and it was clear that Zébédée's views were causing significant unrest. Zébédée's conflict with Viry came to a head during a colloquy where Viry criticized Zébédée's approach to the ascension of Christ. Viret argued that one should not speak of Christ's body in a natural or philosophical way, but should focus on the spiritual presence of Christ in the Eucharist. This disagreement was significant, and it further strained the relationship between the two men. Despite the challenges and conflicts, Zébédée's life and work continued to influence the Protestant movement. His story is a testament to the complex and often contentious nature of religious reform in the 16th century, where personal beliefs and institutional pressures often collided, shaping the course of history. The story of the Lausanne Theses and the controversies surrounding them paint a vivid picture of the Reformation era, a time when ideas and beliefs were rigorously debated. The discussions and conflicts between the reformers, such as Viret, Calvin, and Bolsec, highlight the complexity of theological and political dynamics in the 16th century. Viret a prominent figure in Lausanne, was deeply involved in these debates. He and his colleagues presented a series of theses that emphasized the importance of the sacraments and the role of the Church. However, these theses were met with opposition from other reformers, particularly the Zwinglians, who felt that the theses placed too much emphasis on the physical aspects of the sacraments. The tensions escalated when a man named Zébédée, a teacher in Yverdon, began to voice his concerns about the direction of the Church. His complaints were taken seriously, and the Bern Council, a powerful authority in the region, was drawn into the conflict. This led to a series of letters and meetings where the reformers tried to resolve their differences, but often ended up deepening the divide. One of the most significant episodes was the controversy involving Jérôme Bolsec, a doctor and theologian who disagreed with Calvin's views on predestination. Bolsec's outspoken criticism of Calvin's doctrine led to his imprisonment and eventual exile. This event was a turning point, as it revealed the intense emotions and high stakes involved in these theological debates. The relationship between Farel and other reformers, such as Calvin and Beza, also faced challenges. Farel's efforts to maintain harmony and seek understanding were often met with resistance, and he found himself in the middle of a growing rift within the reformer community. Despite the difficulties, Farel continued to advocate for a balanced approach to theology and church governance. The debates over predestination and the nature of the sacraments were not just academic. They had real-world implications. They affected the lives of ordinary people and the way they understood their faith. The decisions made in Lausanne and Bern had a lasting impact on the Reformation movement and the development of Protestantism. In the end, the reformers had to navigate a complex landscape of religious and political pressures. Their disagreements often led to personal and professional consequences, but they also contributed to the rich tapestry of Reformation thought. The Lausanne Theses and the controversies surrounding them serve as a reminder of the importance of dialogue and understanding in matters of faith and belief. This period of history shows us that even the most passionate and committed individuals can find themselves at odds over deeply held beliefs. It also reminds us that the journey of reform and change is often marked by conflict and challenge, but it can also lead to growth and new insights. The legacy of these debates continues to influence religious and philosophical discussions to this day.